We're going to do a question and answer thing, and there's going to be a microphone that's here in the middle. And so if you want to ask a question, just come up to the mic and ask your question. And we're going to have some questions that are also fed in from people who are watching this through streaming. So just make sure, please, that you give the question loud enough so everybody can hear it through the mic.
Bart, real quick, thank you. Before we go on any further, you're being translated simultaneously in 9 languages, and our translators have asked, as you continue, if you could just slow down on your answers a little bit. There's a little smoke coming from over in that section over there.
Sorry.
So the way we're going to do this is, as you asked, we're going to take questions both online from our streaming group, and we have close to 800 that are joining us from over 40 countries around the world. They're going to be submitting questions through their online program here, and I will interject between those that are here in the hall lining up and our questioners so that our people around the world get an opportunity to ask as well. Okay. So we'll start here in the hall first.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you very much for an excellent, even riveting presentation. Made me want to go back to school. My question is whether or not either in the Gospel of Judas or if not in other studies that you've undertaken, if you have any understanding or view with respect to Mary Magdalene or Thomas, Dan Brown notwithstanding.
Yes, right. Right. Do I have any opinion about Mary Magdalene and Thomas? Yes. Opinions about both of them. Both of these figures, Thomas and Mary, are important figures to Gnostics. So let me first talk about Thomas briefly. Thomas is known outside of those interested in Gnosticism. Thomas is thought of as the first missionary to take the gospel to India. That is a later legend. It's probably not historically accurate. We have several books that are connected with Thomas, and in those books, his name is given as Judas Didymus Thomas, or Didymus Judas Thomas. So, as it turns out, the name Thomas the word Thomas is an Aramaic word that means twin. And Didymus is a Greek word that means twin, which means that his real name is Judas or Jude. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus has 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And so this person is named Jude or Judas the twin, and the question is, twin of whom? Well, in Syriac Christianity in the land of Syria, it was thought that Jesus' brother Jude was actually his twin brother. More than that, he was Jesus' identical twin brother. Now you wonder, how can early Christians think that Jesus has an identical twin brother if his mother was a virgin? So I don't know what the answer is, but I have a hunch. My hunch is this. We know from Greek and Roman mythology instances in which a woman gives birth to twins, one of whom is son of a mortal and the other is the son of a god. The most famous instance of this is Hercules. Hercules' mother, Alcmena, was pregnant already when Zeus looked down from heaven and saw Alcmena, saw that she was drop-dead gorgeous, decided he had to have her, came down, had sex with her all night, and while her husband was off at war, and then went back up to heaven. He came in, he disguised himself to look like her husband. She thought her husband had come back from war because Zeus looked just like her husband. But Zeus went back to heaven. It turned out the next day her husband did come home and wondered why his wife didn't welcome him with open arms. She just had a long night frolicking in those arms. So, but as a result, Zeus or Jupiter got her pregnant too, and so Hercules had a twin brother, Iphicles. In Greek, Heracles and Iphicles. One of them, Iphicles, was the son of the father, and the other was the son of Zeus, or Jupiter, depending whether you're doing it in Roman or Greek. Well, it may be that these people thought the same thing, that God had gotten Mary pregnant, but that Joseph also had gotten her pregnant, so they didn't believe in the virgin birth, these people. But he was a twin brother, and it turns out in some of these stories told about Thomas, they play on the idea that he's actually Jesus' twin. The most interesting story is in the Acts of Thomas, which is the first account we have of Thomas going to India to be a missionary. Thomas lands en route to India. He lands at a city. He's on a ship, and they land, and they go in the harbor. And there's a couple getting married there. The daughter of the king is marrying a local aristocrat. This Acts of Judas is an ascetic text. It's a text that believes you should not indulge in the pleasures of the flesh. So you shouldn't eat good food. You shouldn't drink good wine. You shouldn't have sex, even if you're married. Well, so that's the point of view of this text. Luckily, it did not make it into the New Testament. Thomas tries to discourage this married couple from having sex, even though they just got married. And he has no luck at all. They kick him out, he leaves, and then they go into their bridal chamber, and there he is sitting on the bed. They don't understand this because they just saw him leave. Well, actually, it's his twin brother Jesus, who's come down from heaven in order to try to convince them not to have sex. And, he's the Son of God. He's more effective rhetorically. And so he actually convinces them not to have sex, and they don't. And for this book, that's a good thing. And so, but this is playing on the idea that they're identical twins. So we have these stories about Thomas. We have books allegedly written by Thomas that are interesting gospels, not in the New Testament. The Gospel of Thomas is the most famous of the non-canonical gospels, a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus, some of which Jesus may actually have said, that was discovered in 1945. So that's Thomas. Mary Magdalene is another very important figure in some ways in early Christianity. Mary Magdalene is not as important in the history of Christianity as she is in the Da Vinci Code. In the Da Vinci Code, of course, Jesus and Mary are lovers, and they have a baby, and this baby is the founder of the Merovingian dynasty in France. Well, all of that's just completely made up. What most people don't realize is that Mary Magdalene in the New Testament does not play a prominent role in the life of Jesus. In fact, she hardly ever appears. Mary Magdalene shows up only one time in all four Gospels during Jesus' public ministry. In Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, we're told that Joanna, Susanna, and Mary Magdalene and a group of other women supported Jesus and the disciples financially while they went around doing their preaching and teaching and such. That's all it says. That's it in his entire ministry. So there's nothing about her being, one of the inner disciples, being his lover, being anything like that. Where Mary Magdalene comes to be important in the New Testament Gospels is at the end. Because according to the Gospels, Jesus and the disciples went to Jerusalem his last week, and a group of women went with them. Jesus got arrested. The men disciples fled, but the women stayed there. They had nothing to fear. They saw him get crucified, including Mary Magdalene. And then they saw where he got buried, and on the third day, they're the ones who went to the tomb and found that it was empty and realized he had been raised from the dead. And Mary is the first to declare that Jesus was raised from the dead. That makes her highly significant. You could argue, if that's historically right, that Mary Magdalene is the first to say that Jesus got raised from the dead. You could make the plausible argument that Mary Magdalene started Christianity. That would be big. I mean, it's not the same thing as having his babies, but it'd still be big. And so anyway, so that's Mary Magdalene. There are some Gnostic Gospels where Mary figures prominently, and there's a gospel called the Gospel of Mary, which is a Gnostic revelation that's given to Mary rather than to the disciples. You're welcome.
Good evening, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
My question is about Sophia and wisdom, as you were talking to us about that. And in some of the other writings, these aeons and the many levels of heaven and creation and the beings that come from each other, I noticed in your one of the lectures I heard online that you were giving, you talked about this being something that we see in many of these Gnostic writings. So my question is, have you seen a parallel, in particular with Sophia and the 12 that came from her? Is there any parallel between those gods and the Sumerian gods, Enki, Enlil, and those that are described by Zechariah Sitchin and that are on the Sumerian tablets?
So you lost me there at the end.
Okay, let me see if I can go back.
The Samaritan, is there a similarity between Sophia and those gods that came from her and the what?
And those gods that are written about in the Sumerian tablets. And in particular, I'm thinking of Enki and Lil and those that came with him.
Yes,
them.
I'm sorry, I don't know a good answer to your question. I don't know if there's a relationship or not.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good evening. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, would you give us a brief overview of its content?
Yeah. Right. Okay. So the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is a little bit frustrating because these holes that I showed you in this thing, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is missing entire pages right at the key point. And there's missing pages at the beginning, so it starts sort of in the middle of things. And Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's giving them a revelation of some kind about the soul ascending to heaven. And so there's this revelation at the beginning that's just mainly cut off. And then then Jesus leaves. Tells them not to be afraid. He needs to leave. He leaves, and the disciples start getting all upset because they're afraid now that what happened to Jesus is going to happen to them. And Mary Magdalene tells them they don't need to be afraid because Jesus has just said, "Don't be afraid," and she tries to comfort them. The disciples ask Mary if it's possible for her to give them the revelation that Jesus gave to her, because they had heard that since she was the most beloved of women, that Jesus had revealed something to her. And Mary Magdalene says that she will reveal this, that Jesus did give her a revelation. And she starts off by talking about how she had asked Jesus a question, and Jesus started responding. And Jesus started explaining how the soul goes up to heaven. And right at that point is where the pages are missing. So So it kicks in after that, though, and the soul is going through certain levels. The heavens have levels, and so this material world is the bottom world, and above this there are layers of heavens, and the soul has to go through these layers, and they're layers like ignorance and darkness, and they're layers that have to be conquered. So it's the soul has to conquer these things that are keeping it down here on earth. And the gods of these heavens don't want the soul to go up, and they're trying to restrict it, but the soul is more powerful and is able to go up. So Mary tells this revelation about how the soul then ascends by escaping the entrapments of this material world. She finishes this, and the male disciples start having an argument about whether this could actually be a revelation from Jesus or not, because after all, it was given to a woman. And so, would Jesus really tell her something that he didn't tell us? probably not. And they start having this argument, and Peter makes Mary cry, but finally Levi says, Peter, you're a hothead. Jesus loves her more than he loves us, and he's revealed this to her. And so then they agree with that, and they go out and preach the gospel. So that's the gospel of Mary Magdalene. Welcome.
Greetings and welcome.
Thank you.
What else can you share about the 12 women disciples?
I don't believe there were 12 women disciples. So there were women followers of Jesus. They weren't called disciples. They just were women who followed him. And so we don't have a record of 12 women disciples. Do you have something specific in mind?
I was interested in elaboration on what you've already shared. I also have additional questions. The first one would be your reference to Sophia with respect to the description of the original heavens, or how would you describe prior to the fool and the raving maniac?
Yes. So Sophia doesn't figure prominently in the Gospel of Judas. She does figure prominently in other Gnostic Gospels and in a variety of ways. In some Gnostic circles, Sophia was the last of the eons that emanated from in the divine realm. And either because, in some texts, Sophia does something wrong, and there are different understandings of what she did wrong. For example, in one form of Gnosticism, Sophia, since she's wisdom, she wants to understand the entire divine realm. But this is too much for her, and she overreaches her grasp. And since she overreaches her grasp, she falls outside the pleroma, and this leads to the generation of other divine beings. She gives birth to other divine beings without a male consort, and so these divine beings are misformed. And the main divine being she gives birth to is a divine being called Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth is the one who then says that he alone is God, and he creates the material world as a place of entrapping Sophia. He and his minions, his other angels, trap Sophia here in human bodies, so that Sophia is herself the spark within some of us. Those of us who have a spark within have a spark of Sophia, and Sophia, the point of this religion then is to set her free. In most of these systems, though, Sophia is the last one, and somehow or other she gets excluded from the pleroma leading to the creation.
Okay, so my overarching question would be, wherein lies the value of these nuances and various machinations?
Yes. So for the Gnostics, I think the idea is what I was trying to say at the end, is that in the Orthodox understanding, it's really quite simple. There's a God up there who's created this world. And Gnostics want to say it just is not that simple. This world is not simple. The world above us is not simple. It's extremely complex. And part of religion is getting your mind around it. And so understanding this divine realm in itself is a kind of act of salvation, where once you understand all of the complexities of the eons and the luminaries and the firmaments and the angels and all of that, if you can get your mind around that, then in a sense you've acquired the mind of God. And it's that which can help bring salvation then. So that's why they're so complex, and they're not easy to understand. If they're easy to understand, they wouldn't be secret revelations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I realized that you were talking about Mary Magdalene, and you indicated in some of the responses that you said came from the disciples with respect to the fact that she was basically second class and not important. You also indicated that there are at least, as far as you're concerned, 40 other Gospels that never made it into the New Testament, and people like Dan Brown have said there are 80, and a number of Gospels that could be floating around, discovered or undiscovered. Is it plausible, based on the fact that women were considered second class, that there is indeed a gospel out there somewhere that attests to the fact that Mary Magdalene was indeed married to Jesus, that they did have 2 children, Sarah and James, and that they lived a life and that Jesus actually engaged in sex, on the one hand? And also, is it plausible that there was a very real reason why this was never included in the religions that came from that time and that period, which said basically that women were unclean, women were not important, and to put Mary Magdalene as a central figure at that time would indeed have changed the world's outlook on women, period. So could there have been a group, let's say, that knows of the existence of the gospel that would affirm that in history that you yourself are not aware of, or that others are not aware of? Because clearly there is documentation, I think, that we're all aware of, that claims to the fact that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and that they indeed had children.
No,
So is it plausible that that is a possibility from your perspective?
There's no historical document of any kind that says anything about Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene.
Okay, I'll give you something very. There's a group in France that I went to visit, and there's a group of monks, and they're called the Dimitri group of monks. That's the Dimitri group of monks, and they're in France, and they still have the grotto, according to them, that Mary Magdalene passed her
Yes.
last 30 years of her life, blah, blah, blah. And when you go into there and you go into the grotto, they have etchings that allegedly was Jesus and etchings of Mary Magdalene and their 2 children, Sarah and James. So I raised the question, I was surprised, number one, that that was their belief. That's fundamental to their belief, that they were actually married. And they began to tell me why they believe that this is so. Now, I didn't see the documentation clearly. I'm only telling you that this is what
Yes.
was true, and other people believe this fact. So I'm asking you, do you think it is plausible, as a historian who has found and examined some documentation, you didn't know that the lost Gospel of Judas existed until it was found, for example, and that verified certain things for you, whether you believe it or not, but from a historical perspective. So I'm only trying to find out if you think it is plausible, as a historian, that Mary Magdalene could have been married to Jesus and they indeed had children. Is it a possibility or a potential?
No, I don't think so. So, so it is true that you can go to a lot of places in the world and they will tell you legends of early Christianity. So you can go to India and they will tell you that Thomas started Christianity here. You can go to Alexandria, Egypt, and they will tell you Mark started Christianity here. You can go throughout the world and they will relate what they understand to be the history of the place. These are based on legends. So if you're asking me as a historian, are these legends based on history, I'm telling you no. So the idea of Mary Magdalene going to France is not found in any early Christian document. You start finding it in the Middle Ages. Its most popular form was in a book called The Golden Legend that was published in 1279. And that's where most of these legends today go back from. This was the most widely read book in the Middle Ages, even more than the Bible in many places. But it's not based on any historical record that we have. Now, if you're asking, is it possible that there was a gospel that had that no longer survives? Anything is possible. But historians have to go on the basis of what's probable. And the fact that you have later legends doesn't make something probable. It simply means that later legends showed up. I will say there is one gospel that is referred to by a 4th century church father named Epiphanius, which does connect Jesus and Mary Magdalene and sex, but not in the way that you might suspect. Epiphanius was a heresiologist, a completely unreliable heresiologist who wrote a book in the year 380 called the Panarion, which means the medicine chest. He saw it as providing the antidotes for the bites of the serpents of heresy. And in this book, he discusses 80 different heresies prior to his day, including a group that he called the Fabianites, who were a group of Gnostics. According to Epiphanius, the Fabianites had a book called The Greater Questions of Mary, referring to Mary Magdalene. And he gives only one quotation from this book, The Greater Questions of Mary. And according to this quotation, what happened was Jesus took Mary Magdalene up onto a mountaintop, and while she was watching, he reached into his side and pulled out a woman. And he started having sex with her. And when he came to climax, he pulled out, gathered a semen in his hand, started eating it, and saying, "This you must do if you want to have eternal life." Mary fainted. And that's the end of the story. That's what Epiphanius says. So this is Epiphanius claims that this group of the Fabianites liked this gospel because this replicated their own rituals. According to Epiphanius, these Fabianites had a particular style of worship that he found to be completely scandalous, and he was a bit of a voyeur, so he tells us all about it. According to Epiphanius, the way these Gnostic Christians worshipped is they had their meetings at night, and when they would get together, they would all greet one another and shake hands, but the ones who were the real members would tickle themselves under the wrist, so they would know that they were the real members, or it might have actually be meant as an erotic gesture. When the outsiders would leave, the insiders would have a big meal and stuff themselves and get drunk on wine, and then they would each pair off with somebody other than their own spouse and go off and have sex. And when the man reached climax, he would pull out, they would eat his semen, and they would say, "This is the body of Christ." And if the woman was having her period, they would gather some of her blood and consume that and say, "This is the blood of Christ." Epiphanius goes on to say that those who were high priests in this organization didn't have to have sex with women. They could do it in the privacy of their own home. They could engage in sacred masturbation. The other thing he says about these men having sex with these women is that the whole idea is that when they came to climax, they were supposed to call out the name of one of the divine beings who inhabited one of the 365 realms of heaven, so that their soul could, this was like a password to get through that. And so since your soul had to go down from heaven and go back up to heaven, that meant that everybody had to engage in the sex ritual 760 times. 365 up, 365, or 730 times. Right, so, yeah, so that's a gospel I want to be discovered. I mean, I actually don't think it existed, but I wish it did, and I hope it did. I mean, I think it'd be great, but it's probably not going to happen. So are there other gospels that could contain something? Yes. Is it likely that they have something about Jesus and Mary being married? It's possible. There is another gospel that does mention Jesus and Mary having a relationship, but probably doesn't mean what people reading it naturally might think it means. It's the Gospel of Philip. It was discovered in 1945. The Gospel of Philip is a very interesting gospel, but it's very hard to understand. At one point in the Gospel of Philip, we're told that Jesus and Mary frequently kissed. This is another manuscript page that has holes in the manuscript because worms have eaten it away. And what the passage says is that Jesus frequently used to kiss Mary on the, and there's a hole in the manuscript. So you're not sure where he was kissing her, but it was someplace. So now the thing about that manuscript, people have used that, it's actually in the Divinity Code. It quotes it without pointing out that there's a hole in the manuscript. But the thing about the Gospel of Philip is this probably is not meant as a sexual act. In the Gospel of Philip, kissing was a ritual that was engaged in the Christian worship services, as it was in other circles. And the reason for the holy kiss was because the Word of God comes from the mouth. And so when you kiss a fellow Christian, you're delivering to them the Word of God. And so this is saying that Jesus gave a revelation to Mary. It isn't some kind of divine foreplay. It's just a revelation. So those are the passages that talk about Jesus and Mary that have anything having to do with sex. Is it possible that there's some other gospel that we don't have that mentions them being married? Yes, it's possible, but it seems. So that's one set of questions. The other set of questions is, was Jesus married to Mary Magdalene? And historically, the answer is absolutely not. No, he wasn't married to Mary Magdalene. So, yes, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and best wishes to you on your research and your future discoveries.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi.
I found your book really interesting, and I remember being angry a few times reading it, and in the summer, something like that. Anyways, I'm kind of interested. You said that history, which is what you study and look at, is often, I thought you said something really astute when you were saying that it's written by the winners. And you said that's the orthodoxy, and then we call these others the heresy. That is, that they don't have the right belief. Is that what most historians think? I think that seems very forward-thinking and progressive. I have not necessarily heard that same or understood that. In fact, what I've often heard is that the orthodoxy is the right belief, and that the heresy is indeed heresy, even as you were talking to the last person and saying, well, this is kind of a heretical point of view.
Yeah.
And so that was my first part to the question. Do you think that people that, like you and other historians, really do think that and are aware that the history, that is that which is written by the winners,
Yes.
is written by males?
Yeah.
It really is a select perception as opposed to something that may have been broader?
Yes, that's a very widely held view. The only people who don't hold this view with respect to early Christianity are conservative Christians who are themselves standing in the tradition that won out.
Right.
And they want to maintain that this is the Orthodox tradition. It's always been Orthodox. It goes
Right.
all the way back to Jesus and the apostles. They handed it on, and so it's always been Orthodoxy. But apart from conservative evangelical or fundamentalist Christians, that's not that everyone
That's not
else.
the widespread.
Pardon me?
That's not widespread.
No, it's
is
just,
what you
it's
would
just
say.
found among conservative Christians and fundamentalists.
Well, that's great. I was not so clearly aware of that. So
Yeah, no,
that's really a helpful thing.
Yes.
The second part of my question is, when you then are looking at history and what you would call were history, just like in your books that you're writing, I have not read the forgery ones, where you are, I assume, documenting that history has been changed and plagiarized, etc. and we certainly see it today. That goes on. Do you think that when you start to say, as you said to the last speaker, well, these are legends, so they're not, we don't really consider them historical information. Are you then saying that the really only history would be something that's written?
No. And I'm not saying that history is the only thing that matters, but I thought that she was asking about whether historically Jesus really was married to Mary Magdalene.
Right.
And I'm saying that you might have legends about that later.
Right.
By legend, I mean something that is a story that is not rooted in what actually happened historically.
How would you know that?
How do I know that Jesus wasn't married to Mary Magdalene?
No. How would you know that a legend is not based in the rooted of history?
Yeah, well, that's what history does. History tries to figure out what actually happened and what are rumors and legends that did not actually happen. And so historians have methodologies for trying to figure out what actually happened in the past. And it's people, we do this all the time.
Right.
Right? We ourselves want to know, with a child or with a spouse, did you really do that?
Right.
Right? Well, you
Right.
want to know if they really did that.
Right.
Or is that just something you heard that didn't really happen? And so that's what historians do with the past. And it's not an exact science. I mean, you can't conduct history the way you conduct a chemical experiment or something, because the past is past and there's no access to it except from sources that survive. And so you have to evaluate the sources, and there are ways of doing that are more productive for figuring out what actually happened and what didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I want to say is that I am not belittling the legends. I'm not saying,
Right.
oh, it's just a legend. In fact, legends are terrifically interesting. And
They just may not be history, is what you're
it may
saying.
not be what actually happened, but that's just one set of questions. One set of questions is what really happened. The other is what were people saying about it.
Mm-hmm.
And both things are equally interesting, but they're different questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, Bart, thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions that have come in from our streaming students, so we've been collating those, and I've chosen a few. Many of them have been duplicates, but before we get to that, Jay-Z asked if you would, on her behalf, she asked you about what your belief, your persuasion was that you shared earlier this evening. Would you be willing to share that with our school and explain why?
Right. Sure. Okay. Thank you, Jay-Z. All right, I'm going to give a fuller scoop, actually, than I gave over dinner. Just to explain a little bit about why I am what I am. Okay, so brief sort of autobiographical thing. I was raised as a Christian in the Episcopal Church as a rather, social Christian, not completely religious. I was more like an Episcopagan. But then when I was in high school, I had a born-again experience and became a very hardcore evangelical Christian, evangelistic, trying to convert people, very hardcore believer, believed that the Bible had no mistakes of any kind whatsoever. And after high school, I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is where we used to say Bible is our middle name. And it's a fundamentalist Bible college. Just so we're on the same page, when I say fundamentalist, let me just tell you what I mean. A fundamentalist is no fun, too much damn, and not enough mental. I was a fundamentalist. I got interested in the study of the New Testament as a student at Moody Bible Institute. When I was 17 years old, my first semester, I was taking a class on the Gospel of John, and I was committed to it as a sacred book. But I thought, this guy teaching this class is teaching the Gospel of John, and he's getting paid for that. This is amazing. I want to do that. And so I decided I wanted to become a Bible scholar when I was 17, and I never left that path. I went through, majored in Bible theology at Moody Bible Institute. I went to Wheaton College, which is the alma mater of Billy Graham, which was a step towards liberalism for me. And then I took Greek in college and was pretty good at it. I decided I wanted to study the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament in graduate school, and so I went off to Princeton Theological Seminary to study with the world's expert on Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, a man named Bruce Metzger, who was a very famous scholar, a very pious Christian gentleman who was my mentor for 7 years and was a very important figure in my life. While I was at Princeton Theological Seminary, I started realizing that my beliefs in the Bible really didn't make sense, because there are, in fact, mistakes in the Bible, and they're there for anybody to see. And I started seeing them. And once I started finding the mistakes in the Bible, that started changing my theology about everything. And as time went on, I started questioning whether Jesus really was the Son of God. Eventually, I started questioning whether there was a God. My scholarship led me away from evangelical Christianity to become a liberal Christian. I was a liberal Christian for a number of years, still a believer. I still believed in God. I still thought Jesus was special and that the Bible was important, but I didn't think it was the inspired Word of God or anything like that. But I was a liberal Christian. It was only about 15 years ago that I decided I could no longer be a believer in any sense not because of my scholarship on the Bible, but because of the problem of suffering. I got to a point where I simply didn't believe that there's a God who's in control of this world. If you look around at all of the misery and the pain and the suffering, it doesn't look to me like God's intervening in this world and answering prayer and saving people and helping people. It doesn't look like that at all. In fact, we live in a world where every 12 seconds some child dies of starvation. So, I mean, it's nice that I prayed to God and He helped me find a parking place, but I mean, this kid just died of starvation. So, and every 12 seconds, and 300 people every hour die of malaria, and you've got your own list. So, I came to a point where I simply didn't believe that God existed anymore, and at that point, I became an agnostic. This is where the dinner conversation kicks in. I became an agnostic because I thought that agnostics and atheists were 2 degrees of the same thing. When I became an agnostic, I didn't realize that both agnostics and atheists, in fact, are extremely militant about their positions. Atheists all think that agnostics are simply wimpy atheists, and agnostics think that all atheists are simply arrogant agnostics. I mean, so the atheists say, well, you're just too chicken to say what you really think. And the agnostics say, yeah, well, you actually don't know anything either. So now, today, I actually consider myself to be both an agnostic and an atheist, because I don't think they're 2 degrees of the same thing. I think they're 2 different things. Agnosticism has to do with what you know, and atheism has to do with what you believe. So the word agnostic, I mean, I've been throughout here talking about Gnostics as people who know, and agnostic as somebody who doesn't know. And so if you ask me, is there some kind of divine superior force in the universe? I don't know. And neither does anyone else, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, people, of course, say they do. I don't think anybody knows. I mean, I know most of you think you do know. So you're Gnostics. All right, so you're Gnostics, I'm agnostic, I don't know. And, but do I believe that there's a superior God? No, I don't believe in the God of the Bible, so I'm an atheist as well. So that's my answer. I'm both an agnostic and an atheist.
Thank you for your truth and honesty. We're grateful. From the world, our first question we have is from Dominique Gum. She's writing us tonight, actually in the morning over there in Barcelona, Spain. She says, Jesus had a son named Marcus, did he? And is this the one that we call Saint Mark the Evangelist?
Well, historically, the answer is no. Jesus did not have a son named Marcus. Jesus was almost certainly not married. So Mark the Evangelist is not, even in the Christian tradition, not related to Jesus. John Mark is a figure who appears in the book of Acts, who is a Christian in the book of Acts. He's not one of the 12 disciples. He's somebody who converts. He's a Jew who lives in Jerusalem, who comes from a wealthy family, who, according to the later legends, ended up starting the church in Alexandria, Egypt. So he started Christianity in Egypt. So if you talk to Coptic Christians today, they'll tell you that Mark is the one who originally started the church. That's a later legend. That's almost certainly not historically accurate. He was thought by some to have written the second gospel of the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark, although we actually don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Whoever wrote it is anonymous, doesn't tell us what his name is. But it came to be attributed to Mark, who was thought to be a companion of Peter. So that the Gospel of Mark, by that tradition, then carries the power, the authority of Peter. But I think Jesus was not married at all, and that he. I've said this several times, and I keep seeing skeptical looks on your face when I say that. That I don't think Jesus was married. So let me tell you why I think this. All right, several things just to kind of clear out the brush. In the New Testament, there's no word about Jesus being married, no word about him having a lover or a spouse or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, although he did run around those 12 disciples. All right, so there's that. Some people, basing their views again on Dan Brown, say that Jewish men were always married in the ancient world. Well, it's not true. It can't be true. We know it's not true. The reason it can't be true is because in the ancient world, except in times of real serious war, men outnumbered women all the time. Men outnumbered women all the time because so many women died in childbirth. And so there were always more men than women, which means every man could not be married. It's just a sociological fact. Apart from that, we know that there were Jewish men who were not married in the days of Jesus. The Jewish men who were not married in the days of Jesus happened to be Jewish men who held the same theological and ideological views that Jesus had. They were apocalypticists. An apocalypticist is a Jewish person who thinks that the end of the age is imminent, that God very soon is going to intervene in the course of evil affairs to overthrow the forces of evil and set up his good kingdom on earth. And this is going to happen very soon. This is the view that was held, for example, among the Jews who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in 1947. This was a group of Jews called the Essenes, and we know from a number of ancient sources that the Essenes, who held these apocalyptic views, did not get married. Why didn't they get married? Well, we don't know exactly, but they were people thinking that the end was coming very soon, and they wanted to prepare for it, and they probably thought that marriage would interfere with their preparations for the end of all time. Jesus also was an apocalyptic Jew who thought that the end was coming within his disciples' lifetime. He told his disciples, "Some of you standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power." And he meant that, not that, you're going to die and go to heaven. He meant the kingdom of God's coming here. The end of the age is imminent. We know of another Jew who was unmarried, the Apostle Paul. was Jewish, and he told his followers in Corinth that he wished they would be like him, namely celibate. He also was an apocalyptic Jew. So the idea of an apocalyptic Jew like Jesus would be unmarried is not unprecedented. In fact, it seems to have been well known at the time. But there is a piece of evidence that Jesus absolutely was not married. It's a little bit complicated. So Jesus had a controversy with another group of Jews who, oh God, I don't want to get into that. That would take 5 minutes. Jesus had a controversy with a group of Jews. I'm not going to get into the details. Where Jesus tells these Sadducees, okay, I've got to give it. Okay, so, I mean, it's not that interesting, but okay. So here's the deal. So Jesus believes that at the end of the age, people are going to be raised from the dead. This is an apocalyptic view. Jesus and other apocalypticists thought that when God destroys the forces of evil that are making this world such a wretched place, he's going to bring in his kingdom, and everybody's going to be raised from the dead. And people who have been against God are going to face eternal punishment, and people who have sided with God are going to enter into his kingdom. So there's another group of Jews called the Sadducees, who were very important in first century. They were the power players in first century Palestine. And the Sadducees did not believe in the future resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees believed that once you were dead, you stayed dead. You ceased to exist. That's why they were Sadducees. Okay, all right. Okay. Okay. All right. So the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection, and they think the idea of a resurrection is ridiculous. So they come up to Jesus and they say, "Okay, you believe in a resurrection. So here we've got this problem. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, it says that if a man marries and he dies, leaving his wife childless, his brother is supposed to marry the woman and bring up a child in the dead brother's name so that his line can be continued." Yes, okay, that is what it said. They said, okay, so there's a man who married this woman, and he was one of 7 brothers. And he died, and so his brother married her, but then no children. He died, then the third one married, he died. All 7 married her. So in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? Well, good question. Right, so they're setting a trap for Jesus, and if you've read the New Testament, you know Jesus can always get out of these traps, and what he does in this case is he says that they haven't read the scriptures carefully, because if they had, they would know that in heaven, people will be like the angels who neither marry nor are given in marriage. Angels don't marry, people won't marry, there's not going to be a problem with these 7 guys. Now, okay, so what does that have to do with Jesus being married? It's just this. Jesus taught that the end of the age was coming soon, that God's kingdom was soon going to arrive, and that kingdom was going to be a utopian-like place. There's not going to be any war. There won't be any natural disasters. There'll be no oppression. There'll be no injustice. There'll be no hatred. It'll be a perfect place. And Jesus' ethics were an attempt to get his disciples to start living in those ways in the present. If there'll be no war in the kingdom, you should be a peacemaker now. If there'll be no hatred in the kingdom, you should love everybody now. If there'll be no illness in the kingdom, you should heal the sick now. If there'll be no demons in the kingdom, you should cast out demons now. If there'll be no oppression in the kingdom, you should work for justice now. You should implement the ideals of the kingdom in the present. If in the kingdom there'll be no marriage or giving in marriage, then to implement that ideal in the present means not to get married. If that's what Jesus taught, he almost certainly wasn't married. That's the logic. So I think Jesus wasn't married. I think it would have undercut his apocalyptic teaching, and I So I simply don't think he was. And of course, in the tradition, he wasn't married. So, yes.
The next question is from our student Pat Kelly here at Yelm, which is perfect. Next question. She says, was Jesus a rabbi, and didn't rabbis have to be married?
Rats, I wish I would have thought of that. Right. Okay, yes, okay. It's actually, it's a very good question, and it's a little bit complicated. The complication is we don't have records of rabbinic teachings from the first century. So when people say rabbis got married, they're referring to texts that were written centuries after Jesus' day. There were no rabbis in the technical sense in Jesus' day. The rabbinic offices were later. The earliest rabbinic text we have is the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written around the year 200. Jesus died around the year 30. The Mishnah is the core of the Jewish Talmud, which dates from end of 4th, early 5th century. So we're talking about hundreds of years after Jesus' day. And the mistake that scholars made until like about 20 or 30 years ago was to assume that what later rabbis said applied hundreds of years earlier. Scholars today don't think it worked that way any more than you would think that whatever your traffic laws in Yelm are, that somehow that tells you about what traffic laws were in the year 1653, right? I mean, you're living hundreds of years later. Well, the rabbis were living hundreds of years later, and so whatever they said about marriage of rabbis later has no relevance to Jesus. So Jesus is called a rabbi in the New Testament, but at that point, it's not a technical term for an office. It'd be like today, my title is I'm a professor at a university. So that's a kind of title. I'm also a teacher, but there are lots of people who are teachers who are not professors. So professor is like a title that tells you something about my status in the university, and teacher is just something I do that most of you do as well. So all of you could be called teachers, but you're not university professors. So rabbi is kind of like that. Later it came to be like university professor, but in the days of Jesus it just meant teacher, literally meant teacher.
Jay-Z is asking to follow on your conversation tonight. She's saying that in your discussion that all Christians think that God wrote the Bible, and she would like for you to explain about that. And who do you think handled that?
Who wrote the Bible?
Yes.
Right. Okay, I don't think that all Christians think wrote the Bible. I don't think that all Christians think that God wrote the Bible. There are Christians who do think that God wrote the Bible, especially in my part of the world. I teach in the South. I teach in North Carolina, which, as you may have heard, is part of the Bible Belt. And so where I live, actually Christians, many Christians where I live will say, if you don't believe in the Bible, you can't be a Christian. Maybe Christians say that here too, but they certainly say it where I live, which is historical nonsense. Because belief in the Bible has never been a criterion for being Christian, historically. If you look at the creeds of the Christian church historically, the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, these are creeds that Christians say during their worship services that state what they believe. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in his only Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, etc. So you have these creeds that say what you believe, and there's not a word about the Bible in these creeds. So why is it now all of a sudden that the creed is you have to believe in the Bible? Well, it's a very modern cultural phenomenon that has principally hit America. It has not been the standard Christian belief. But there are Christians who think you have to believe in the Bible. There are other Christians who say, no, you don't have to believe in the Bible. I know a lot of Christians who certainly don't believe in the Bible. They don't think Jesus was born of a virgin. They don't think he was literally raised from the dead, but they still call themselves Christian. But there are Christians who do think that God wrote the Bible. It's very conservative evangelical Christians. And Yeah, well, my first movement away from the faith was realizing that God did not write the Bible. Because I realized that there are contradictions in the Bible, there are discrepancies in the Bible, there is mistaken information in the Bible. God had nothing to do with it. And then I came, of course, I don't think God exists. So, of course, God didn't write the Bible. So, who wrote the Bible? People wrote the Bible. I think the Bible's a great book. I mean, I love the Bible. I read the Bible all the time. I read the New Testament in Greek. I read the Old Testament in Hebrew. I study it. I think about it. This is very much a part of my life. But it's a human book. My wife is a scholar of Shakespeare. She reads Shakespeare. She memorizes Shakespeare. She thinks about Shakespeare. She lives Shakespeare. She eats, drinks, sleeps Shakespeare. And I'm that way with the Bible. It's not because she thinks Shakespeare is inspired by God. It's a great corpus, and I think the Bible's a great corpus. So anyway, yeah. So people wrote the Bible.
And she also asks, would you be willing to discuss your concepts with the Book of Revelations by St. John in particular at the end of the book?
You mean the end of the New Testament?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Book of Revelation. Right, well, okay, yeah, right. 20 seconds on the Book of Revelation. So, yeah, it's actually very interesting teaching the Book of Revelation in the South because my students, like a lot of conservative Christians, they think that the Book of Revelation is giving a blueprint for what's going to happen in the future. And if you go to a Christian bookstore today, you go to the section of the bookstore that's on Christian prophecy, and it's all about the Book of Revelation and about how the prophecies are coming to fulfillment today. And, this has always been going on. Every generation thinks that the Book of Revelation is being fulfilled in its generation. This became particularly clear to me when I moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I moved from New Jersey, where nobody believed in the Bible. And so it was a bit of a shock moving to... Well, I moved to North Carolina in 1988, and when I moved, at the precise time I moved in 1988, there was a little booklet that was in circulation that some of you may have heard of. I need to give background because we're not in the South. Do you all know what the term rapture means? Good. Okay. This book was called, so the rapture is when Jesus comes back from heaven and takes all the believers out of the world before the tribulation happens and all hell breaks out on earth. So the rapture is Jesus' return from heaven to inaugurate the end of time. When I moved to Chapel Hill in 1988, there was a book that was in circulation called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. There were 2 million copies of this book in circulation, and I had students whose parents believed, I had students whose parents literally sold the farm because they thought Jesus was coming back. So this book was written, the guy who wrote it wasn't an idiot. He had been a rocket engineer for NASA before he started writing books like this. And he had 88 reasons, and they were pretty interesting reasons. So I'll give you one of them. It's not from the Book of Revelation. Most of them are from the Book of Revelation. This was my favorite one. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and they say, "When's the end going to come?" And Jesus says, "Learn the lesson from the fig tree. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, when all these things place, you know that the end is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place." Okay, Matthew chapter 24, Matthew chapter 24. So, Edgar Whisenant, this NASA scientist, rocket engineer who wrote this book, tries to interpret what this means. What does it mean when the fig tree puts forth its leaves, this generation won't pass away? What's it mean? Well, he points out that in the Bible, the fig tree is often an image for the nation of Israel. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So that's an image of the fig tree being dead through the winter, putting forth its leaves and coming back to life. So when was Israel dead? Well, Israel was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans. When did it become a nation again? 1948. This generation will not pass away before all things take place. In the Bible, a generation is 40 years. 1948 plus 40, bingo. 1988. So, according to Edgar Weissenant, this guy who wrote this book, Jesus was going to come back during the week of Rosh Hashanah in September of 1988. Some of his detractors, even among the fundamentalists, said that they were a little disturbed by this, and they pointed out to him, look, Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour when the end will come. And Weissenant replied, I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week. So Rosh Hashanah came and went, no Jesus. And you probably can predict what Edgar Weissenant did. He wrote another book. And in this other book, he pointed out that he had forgotten that when they came up with the modern calendars, there was no year zero, that it went from 1 BC to 1 AD, and so his calculations were off by a year, so it's going to be 1989. And so it goes. So, right, okay, so the thing is, everybody in my world, and not everybody, a large proportion of the people in my world who are Christian think that the book of Revelation, especially, is predicting what's going to happen in the future, and the prophecies are being fulfilled. In my book on the historical Jesus, it was one of my earlier books. It's called Jesus, the Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium. I try to show that Jesus was an apocalypticist who had this idea that the end was coming soon. And what I do is I start out in the first chapter by showing that in the 1980s, people thought the end was going to come very soon. In the 1970s, they thought it was going to come before 1988. In the 1960s, you start pushing it back, and you can find every generation thinks it's the last generation, and they all have two things in common. Every Christian who's ever said that the world is going to end within their own generation have had two things in common. One is they base it on the book of Revelation. The second is they have all been incontrovertibly wrong. Every single one of them. That you would think that would give somebody pause. You know, when you're thinking, oh, maybe we're right this time. Yeah, right. So when I teach the book of Revelation at Chapel Hill, what I do is I try to stress that the book of Revelation, in fact, is not even intending to be a blueprint for the future. And I talk, what students don't realize, and what most people don't realize, why would they realize this? The book of Revelation is a kind of writing. It's a genre of writing called the apocalypse. It's an apocalypse. And we have other instances of apocalypses from the ancient world, other Jewish and Christian writings that are in this form of book. It's a genre. So you have short story genre, you have limerick poems that are a genre, epic poems are a genre, novels are a genre, apocalypses are a genre. And if you understand how the genre works, you can understand the book. But if you don't understand how the genre works, then you assume it's talking about what's going to happen next week sometime. And so the key is to understand the genre. Once you understand the genre, you realize this is not predicting the future. This is talking about the present at the time this author was writing. He was writing to talk about how God is going to do something about the miserable condition of this place. And if you just hold on and have faith for a little while longer, you'll survive the suffering you're going through. Just hold on. Hold on to your hope and your faith. If you do that, you'll survive. That's what the book's about. The book is not about what's going to happen in Rosh Hashanah in 2008 or whatever. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Shelley Lucas is writing from here in the Olympia, Washington area, and she asks, do you believe there are human beings on this planet who do not have a divine spark?
Do I believe that, personally?
Yes,
I
that's
believe,
her question.
well, it depends what you mean by divine spark. I mean, I don't believe in God, so I don't believe in divine sparks. I mean, so, I mean, I guess another way of putting it, I don't believe that, it's true, I don't believe that there are haves and have-nots. In other words, I don't think that there are some of us who are in some way spiritually superior to others of us. I think that we're all human, and we're all on the same playing field. But I don't believe in a divine spark that's something outside of being human. I think we are completely and totally human, and that we are nothing else. Yeah.
Okay, and
That may not go down here very well.
you can read our audience faces,
you know,
right?
I do have a wife and kids who would like to get out of here.
As our
I've got
team,
to say, though, you're a lot more fun than the fundamentalist groups I talk to.
as we've been taught in this school, the greatest of things are achieved in a light heart. And this is our last question for tonight. This is from Rachel Norton. She's writing us from down under in Australia. She says, first of all, thank you for your great presentation. She asks, after all of your research into the Gospels and the history of religion, what is your overview of creation and the spiritual realm?
Oh, yeah, good question. Right. Yes, here again we may have a few disagreements. I think that we are the products of time and chance. I think that I am an unrepentant and unreconstructed materialist. I think this world is all there is. I don't think that there's a spiritual realm apart from this world. I think that I and no one knows what happened before the Big Bang, but I think that that this universe came into being by forces that we don't understand, but I don't think there was any divine creation behind it. I think that we humans live and we die, and that's the end of our story. When I was a Christian, I was afraid of adopting that view for two reasons. I was afraid of thinking that this life would be all there is. I was afraid to think that because, well, for two things. One was that I thought that if that were true, if I came to think that, I would have no moral compass. I'd have nothing to guide my behavior. And that the result of that was that it would be an orgy every night. When I became an agnostic, I realized that once a week is perfectly fine. The other reason I was afraid of was because it had been drummed in my head that there's eternal life and that if you leave the faith, you're going to roast in hell forever. And I did not think that was a pleasant prospect, and I was afraid of that. And emotionally, it was more of an emotional, it was very, very difficult for me to get over that teaching that had been drummed into me about eternal life, which is something I had thought since I was old enough to think. And so when I was in my 20s and 30s and moving away from the faith, this was a very troubling idea for me. I also thought that coming to think that this life is all there is would lead to a view of despair and meaninglessness and I would find no purpose in life if this life is all there is. Since I've become an agnostic, I've come to realize that that is completely wrong. I have to say that for me personally, life is much more meaningful now that I think this life is all there is. Because I feel now that life, it's a gift without a giver, in a sense. I feel life is a gift, and I feel that I want to grab for everything I can in life. I want to enjoy life to its fullest, and so I do that much more now than I ever did before. And it's not by the orgy once a week. It's by loving and appreciating the little things in life. Good food and good wine, family, friends, relishing deep conversations, personal relationships, grabbing for all of that I can, which is what I try to do with my life now, and I find it more meaningful now than when I was a Christian. The other thing for me, though, is that I find that it is impossible for me to enjoy life to the fullest if I know that other people are suffering and I'm doing nothing about it. For me, personally, I have to be doing things for people who are experiencing pain and misery and despair. And so I've tried to devote part of my life to helping people who are in desperate need. One of the things I do is I have a blog. I'm going to throw out a little pitch here. I have a blog. You can find it on the net. It's the Bart Ehrman blog, the Ehrman blog. People have to pay $24.95 for a year subscription to get on the blog, and the blog is all about early Christianity. Every day, 6 days of the week, I post about a 1,000-word post dealing with some aspect of early Christianity. So today I posted on a new gospel that was discovered, an interesting new it's the gospel manuscript of the Gospel of John, an interesting new manuscript that was discovered, the Gospel of John. I talk about all sorts of things, historical Jesus, early Christianity, Gnostic gospels, et cetera, and I give every cent to charity. So last year, I raised, first year of my blog, I raised $37,000 that I gave to charity, every cent. And this year I hope to do better, and I hope some of you would be willing to join this blog because I hope that you share the values I have. I know that we have different opinions about many things, especially spiritual realities, but I think we can all agree that we should live life to the fullest here and that we should help people in need because doing so is what in part makes us human. Thank you very much.